Astonishing. Is mental health inherited? If so, where's the evidence? Hi, folks, and welcome to Peace Unplugged. Welcome to my new podcasting studio in my cabin in my back garden. I've been looking forward to doing this for a long, long time. So, welcome to Peace Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to exploring the fascinating and complex world of mental health and well-being. Today I'm diving deep into the history of mental health treatments and asking questions about the current treatments that we get and whether there's anything else that can come up that's radical that can change. Essentially, I'm just asking the question, are mental health issues generic? Are the treatments offered today more effective with pharmacological solutions or psychosocial solutions? Or a combination of both? Or perhaps there's some more radical solutions? Perhaps those are more thought-provoking and challenging. So have a think about this and listen through to the end of this podcast to find out my radical thoughts on this. So this isn't just an academic question. For many of us, it's a very, very personal issue. I can vouch for that myself with my own experiences of mental health and the prejudice and the stigma that goes along with that. So I did some research. As I said earlier, let's look at the history of mental health treatments. For centuries, humanity has been seeking solutions for mental distress. Long before the discovery of DNA, as visually described as a double helix graphic, observers noted that certain afflictions of the mind seemed to run in families. This was seen as evidence that poor mental health was inherited. Going back to the 18th and 19th centuries, the early days of modern psychiatry, so-called asylum doctors, while lacking our current understandings of genetics, documented patterns. For example, prominent figures like Philippe Pinel and Benjamin Rush, often considered pioneers in the humane mental health treatment, observed that a predisposition to insanity appeared to be transmitted across the generations. They noted that so-called children of insane parents were more likely to suffer those ailments. This was often seen as a taint or a blemish. And that's what I believe created what we now have. What we now have is a lot more prejudice regarding mental health in the world. One interesting aspect of this early thinking, as highlighted in the historical reviews like the one Kendler in the American Journal of Psychiatry, is that many believed it wasn't the illness itself that was inherited, but rather a predisposition or a vulnerability. This suggests, even then, acknowledging that the environment or moral causes played a role. However, the concept of like begets like often held sway to some troubling implications. Fast forward now to the 20th century. With the rediscovery of Mendel's law of inheritance, theories swung heavily towards genetics. This is where eugenics reared its ugly head and contributed to genocide that occurred during the Second World War with devastating consequences, and that still has a fallout today. The idea was simple, yet chillingly horrific. If mental illness was primarily genetic, then preventing those with undesirable genes from reproducing would improve the overall health of society. Scary, wasn't it? Studies from this area, though for the most part ethically reprehensible by today's standards, attempted to prove direct inheritance. Family pedigree studies meticulously tracked mental illness across the generations, often drawing on sweeping conclusions about bad bloodlines. Critiques of these early studies are now very prominent. They suffered from what is called confirmation bias. In other words, it was the opinion or the belief that only sought evidence for the proof. Factors like personal trauma or environmental considerations such as poverty, social neglect were not considered or heavily influenced by the political climate of the time. In the latter half of the 20th century, scientific methods advanced, so did our understanding. Twin studies and adoption studies became the standard for measuring the effect of genetics. Identical twins, sharing nearly 100% of the genes, were compared to fraternal twins, who shared about 50%. If identical twins showed higher rates for a mental health condition than fraternal twins, it suggested a significant genetic component. Similarly, adoption studies looked at individuals separated from their biological families at birth, comparing their rates of mental illness to both biological and adoptive parents and adoptive relatives. These studies consistently showed that the major mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and even severe forms of depression do have a link to genes. It revealed that relatives of individuals with these conditions are at a statistically higher risk. For example, research indicates that relatives of someone with bipolar disorder have a 6 to 8 times higher risk, and for schizophrenia, it can be up to 10 times higher compared to the general population. However, this is a crucial point. Heritability is not destiny. Even with identical twins, if one develops schizophrenia, the other only has about a 50% chance of developing it. The missing heritability shows that the powerful influence of environmental factors, life experiences, and even pure chance. This is where the nature versus nurture debate comes in. So today, with the advent of the Human Genome Project, large-scale genome-wide association studies, which is called GWAS, we've entered a period of significant genetic discovery. We're no longer looking for a single gene for depression or gene for schizophrenia. We've uncovered that psychiatric disorders are called polygenetic. In other words, more than one gene can have an influence. This means that hundreds, even thousands of common genetic variants, each with a tiny individual effect, contribute to an individual's overall genetic risk. Current research also delves into what is called epigenetics. That's the study of how environmental factors can switch genes on and off without altering the underlying DNA sequence. This is a game changer because it provides a biological mechanism through which stress, trauma, diet, and social experiences can directly influence gene expression and, consequently, brain function and mental health. The critique here is that while genetic discoveries often tantalizing insights, they don't fully explain the lived experience of mental illness, focusing solely on genes risk, ignoring the profound impact of social issues, systematic issues, and adverse child experiences. Mental health is not just a brain issue, it's a whole person issue, and that's linked to our society and our culture. The biomedical model, while valuable for understanding biological arguments, can sometimes inadvertently reduce complex human suffering to a mere chemical imbalance. This leads to focusing on primarily pharmacological solutions. So what do you think? Are mental health issues genetic? The answer to this is both yes and no. There's undeniable evidence is a heightened vulnerability inherited through our biological lineage. This is far from an adequate explanation or solution. Our genes are the loaded gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. Or perhaps more accurate, our genes provide the raw material, and our life experiences define the final form. And now the radical revelation. What if the very concept of mental illness is in itself simply constructed by society and culture? What if our relentless search for generic causes, flaws in the individual's brain, distracts us from perhaps much deeper issues to consider? You see, we live in a global village, don't we? We get constant information via television, film, via radio, and these tell us all the woes of the world. We live on a planet plagued by climate anxiety, world economic issues, international politics and conflicts, social isolation, and systematic oppression. Are rising rates of depression and anxiety truly signs of individual genetic failings, or are they in fact rational responses to an increasingly unwell world? So the radical revelation is this. While biological vulnerabilities exist, a significant portion of what we labelled as mental illness might be better understood as a symptom of societal illness. Our collective mental health is a barometer of the health of our communities, our economies, and our planet. This perspective doesn't dismiss the very real suffering of individuals, nor does it negate the role of biology. Instead, it expands our understanding. It suggests that true mental wellness initiatives must go beyond individual therapy and medication. They must address the root causes of distress in our society, promoting social justice, fostering community resilience, ensuring access to resources for all, and confronting the existential threats that weigh heavily on the human spirit. You see, our neurodiversity is part of the human experience. The challenge isn't to eradicate all forms of mental distress. It is, in fact, to create a world where all minds can thrive, where vulnerability is met with compassion, and where the diagnosis, not just to the individual, to the collective urgent need for mental health to be understood without judgment. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, like, and share. Thank you very much. Martin, Peace Unplugged.